when one thinks about the last 10 years in particular, there's been a lot of research that's emerged that's providing some insight in terms of understanding the risk of prostate cancer. But one of the things I think we should be clear about is prostate cancer is very, what we call heterogeneous, very diverse. Multiple risk factors contribute to it, multiple pathways to prostate cancer. So it's not like this is one magic pill or one magic sort of diet or, you know, coming from a good family of genes or something. You know, there are multiple risk factors. So what do we know now? Well, the biggest risk factors are family history, of course age, family history, and race. And we know that African American men have a much more higher incidence and mortality. So black men are dying much more, larger numbers, almost fourfold higher when you compare them to whites. So black men are dying. And still today, even though there's a debate about PSA, black men are still presenting, higher rates of black men are presenting with more advanced disease than whites, okay? And so these are things that I think we have to sort of really tease apart. Now, when we talk about, you know, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about and others are talking about, we're talking about numbers from publications, from research. And the bulk of that research, 95% of it, is on whites. And so when somebody says, well, you know, maybe we're over-treating or we're doing, you know, some of these men shouldn't have been treated, they're talking about studies looking at white men, okay? Family history, as I mentioned, is one of the biggest risk factors. And so knowing that family history is important, that means that genes are playing a role too, right? So what do we know about genes? Well, there's two sets of what we call these inherited genes. These are genes that we get from our parents, our mother and our father, right? And so there's two classes of those that are called risk genes. There's what we call the high effect and rare genes, and then there's the common low effect genes. So let me give you an example of the high effect genes. We've all heard of BRCA1 and 2 breast cancer mutations, where when you see that mutation, you see that change in the DNA, you see breast cancer. That's what we call high effect. But those are rare. Only, you know, small number of families, small number of women carry those mutations, those changes in their DNA. But then there's the common genes or DNA changes that are like 30% in the population, 40%. And these have low effects. And so you need multiple, you need a lot of those to really see an effect in terms of risk for disease. So what have we found out looking at those two classes of risk genes? Well, we've found very little of those high effect genes for prostate cancer. Most of the last 10 years, you know, there's really just been one recent finding where there's a gene on, I think it's chromosome 17, where there's mutations in that are high penetrant or high effect. And they're very, very rare, maybe 1% in the population. So 1 out of 100 people may carry that mutation. And in some cases, it might even be 1 in 1,000. The common variants are those that we're concerned about, because if you have a lot of those common risk alleles, your risk would go up. Now, when we talk about family history again, I'm going to go back to family history. If you have like 1 to 2 or 3, or the number of increased relatives that have prostate cancer, it increases your risk. So some of us might have a 10-fold increased risk compared to the general population, because we have multiple family members like father and brothers who have prostate cancer. And so we need to be clear that family history is playing a role. And that's one of the things that when you go to your physician, you should talk about. When you're debating if you should get a PSA test, or if you have elevated PSAs, if you're debating a biopsy, family history is something that's very, very important in that discussion. And a lot of times we don't know much about our family history, but that's something that I think we have to try to understand more and more. So genes are playing a role. So those are inherited genes that we get from our parents. But then, you know, as the doc showed you on the board, you know, we have the DNA in our cells, in our body, over our lifetime. And so from childhood, from birth actually, till when you die, you know, your body is being exposed to different environmental, what we call carcinogens or stressors that can change the DNA in your body. So that's a different discussion than the inherited genes, the inherited DNA that you get from your parents. That's due to, those changes occur because we are exposed to certain things like different environmental chemicals or diet or smoking, drinking. And all of those compounds have an effect in terms of changing the ability to change the DNA in our body. And in some cases, it's in our colon. In other cases, it's in our prostate or in our lung. And so we need to be clear. We know smoking is the #1 risk factor for cancer overall, right? Smoking is big. Drinking. But for prostate in particular, we know that there's some dietary factors that decrease risk and also increase risk, right? So what decreases risk? We know lycopenes, that's in tomatoes, something I hate. We also know that some of the antioxidants in fruit and berries are protective against cancer, prostate cancer in particular. There's some emerging data now coming out recently on zinc and vitamin D as protecting, providing some level of protection against prostate cancer. But we have to be careful with that stuff because a lot of these dietary substances, while at one level they may protect, at elevated levels they could increase risk. We see that with calcium, okay? Where recent data in selenium, where it shows that increased selenium, increased calcium increases one's risk for prostate cancer. So it's not just like you can just run to CVS and grab some pills and you know, gargle them, you know, gargle them down. You have to be very careful about that. And then also in relation to your diet too, we're talking about supplementation, but if you have a healthy diet, we're trying to get to the point where we have healthy diets, we don't need to supplement, right? What is that healthy diet? Well, and some of you are going to get very upset about this every time I say this, but increased red meat increases the risk for prostate cancer. And it's not just eating red meat, it's how it's cooked. And we, as African Americans, love to barbecue and burn our meat. I was just at a barbecue the other day, and they were burning some franks. They were fighting over a pan of burnt franks, and I was just looking at them like, these are burnt, y'all. You know, they was like, I want that one. But when you cook the red meat at elevated temperatures, you know, you're releasing some, and you're creating some chemicals that causes DNA damage. Okay, and there have been really good studies looking at not just in the prostate but in the colon. Eating burnt red meat, whether it's char-broiled or grilled, it increases the risk for these chemicals. These what they call DNA adducts. They attach to the DNA and cause DNA damage. So yeah, I like steak, but I eat it medium now. So there's a little bit of red in the middle, but I don't want it burnt all the way through like I used to because I know that that increases the risk for prostate cancer. So those are things that I think we can do. We can understand better. We understand more if we do more research on that, and we can actually impact our risk profile for prostate cancer. Because some of us, we have some of those risk genes because of family history, right? And but that's not a death sentence. I mean, we could actually impact that risk profile by changing our diet and our behaviors, drinking and smoking and all of that. So it's a very complex discussion because, as I said, prostate cancer is very heterogeneous, multiple pathways. We're studying now here in Chicago vitamin D, and we know vitamin D levels are very low in African American men. I'm sure some of your doctors are telling you, if they're not, they should be, that you should look at your vitamin D levels because it plays a role in overall health, not just prostate cancer, but some interesting studies have shown low vitamin D levels increase risk for aggressive prostate cancer. And so that's what we're studying here in Chicago now. So there's no silver bullet. But I think we need to be aware, and we need to be doing several things. We need to be part of this discussion like we're having now. And we need to be involved in the research because it's obvious that the research is informing people to make decisions about you. And if you're not involved in those decision makings, whether it's at the table or part of the study, then, you know, one size doesn't fit all. It doesn't fit all. Dr. Mason, you know, I find it interesting. I'm about to end here, but I find it interesting that you know, more and more we're hearing about individualized medicine, personalized medicine, you know, medicine just for you as an individual. But then at the same time, we're hearing a lot from these committees, these panels who are saying, you know, this is the criteria for everybody. I don't think it goes that way. It should be that way, in particular when we look at high-risk populations like African Americans. And so we need to have these discussions.
I didn't bump it to tell you to stop. What I wanted to do, Rick, is be certain that people understood what it meant by family history. Now, these are blood-related family members, right?
Family. So, and there are different degrees. Like a first-degree family member would be like a father. Second degree would be an uncle. And so, for instance, I have family history. My father was diagnosed with prostate cancer in 2006. My grandfather died of prostate cancer. I have 8 uncles, 2 of which died of prostate cancer. So I have, you know, a high family burden for prostate cancer. And so my risk is probably tenfold higher than most of the people in the room. And probably not most, but, you know, a lot. So family history is something that we know is an important risk factor, and something that in the discussions with your physician should be part of that discussion.
And does it matter at what age they develop prostate cancer?
That's a very good point. I missed that. So African Americans disproportionately present at an earlier age, okay? But when we talk about family history and increased risk, we're talking about those men that are diagnosed before 65 years of age. Okay, those are the ones that are probably going to be more aggressive prostate cancers, because we know from interesting autopsy studies that came out of Detroit that, you know, there's a lot of what we call latent or benign prostate cancer in all populations. In fact, they were looking at men they were doing autopsies on men that died of something else, and found that 60% of men in their 60s, 70% of men in their 70s, 80% of men in their 80s, you know, these were men that they were looking at in terms of prostates, men that died of something else. They had prostate cancer, 80% of men in their 80s. And so, but most of those were what we call latent. They weren't clinically manifested. They weren't those that caused, you know, like any sort of clinical manifestation, but there was prostate cancer cells in the prostate. So that means it's a very common disease. In fact, we're all going to get it if we live long enough. The question is, and this is the question that you raised, is how do we figure out which ones are going to kill you as opposed to the ones that you can live with?